99-year-old Robert Bob Mitchell had never talked about the war. For 76 years, he had lived as a quiet old man. Until Facebook connected him with the son of the British tank commander who died trying to save his life 78 years ago in Germany. And the story he told David Thompson that night changed both their lives forever. Welcome to Hidden Legends. Before we dive into this incredible story, tell us in the comments what city you're watching from today. And hit that subscribe button. Robert Bob Mitchell was the perfect neighbor. Quiet, kind, the type who never bothered anyone. He lived in his small apartment at the retirement community in Ohio, tended his garden, and read books. For 76 years, no one knew anything about Bob's past. His neighbors only knew him as the nice old man. Children called him Grandpa Bob. There were strange details in Bob's apartment that cleaning staff noticed. An old photograph on the mantel showing young men in military uniforms, some metal objects in a glass display case, and most mysteriously, a wooden chest in his bedroom that was never opened. When neighbors asked about his past, Bob always gave the same answer. "I did different jobs a long time ago." Then he would change the subject. Bob Mitchell was born in Cleveland in 1923, the youngest of 3 children. His father worked at the Goodyear plant in Akron. His mother took in sewing to make ends meet during the Great Depression. Despite financial hardships, Bob excelled in school, particularly in mathematics and engineering principles. In September 1941, Bob enrolled at Ohio State University to study mechanical engineering. He lived in a cramped dormitory room, survived on dining hall food and his mother's occasional care packages. His professors noted his analytical mind and steady work ethic. Bob was destined for a successful engineering career. Bob had also joined the Reserve Officer Training Corps program during his freshman year. Twice a week, he would put on his crisp ROTC uniform and participate in military drills, weapons training, and leadership exercises. The program appealed to his systematic nature. Everything had a proper procedure, a chain of command, a logical sequence. He was particularly good at map reading and tactical planning. His instructors consistently rated him among the top cadets in his class. By his sophomore year, Bob had been promoted to cadet sergeant and was being considered for advanced leadership training. December 7, 1941 changed everything. Bob was studying in the university library when someone burst through the doors shouting about radio reports. Students gathered around the lobby radio, listening in stunned silence as news anchors described the attack on Pearl Harbor. His father called that evening from Akron. "Bobby," his father's voice was serious over the crackling long-distance connection. "I know what you're thinking, but don't do anything rash. Finish your education first." But Bob's conscience wasn't clear. Every day he attended classes while young men across the country were enlisting, training, shipping overseas to fight. He felt like a coward sitting in engineering lectures while others risked their lives for freedom. The feeling gnawed at him through the winter and spring of 1942. He had trained to become an officer. 2 years in the Reserve Officer Training Corps program had given him confidence in military leadership. His instructors had told him he had natural command potential. He envisioned himself graduating, receiving his commission, leading men into battle as a second lieutenant. But in early 1944, everything changed. The Army, desperate for infantry replacements after heavy casualties in Italy and preparation for the coming invasion of Europe, made a dramatic decision. The Army Specialized Training Program, which had sent promising young soldiers to college, was abruptly terminated. Bob and thousands of other college students across the country received identical telegrams, report for immediate reassignment to combat units. His dream of becoming an officer evaporated overnight. Instead of graduating with a degree and a commission, he would be sent to the infantry as a private. The news hit him like a physical blow. Everything he had worked for, planned for, disappeared in an instant. His parents drove down from Akron to see him off, his mother crying quietly as they stood on the Columbus train platform. "We're proud of you, son," his father said, gripping his shoulder firmly. "You do what you have to do and come home safe." Bob nodded, unable to speak past the lump in his throat. He shouldered his duffel bag and climbed aboard the train that would take him to Camp Claiborne, Louisiana, where he would complete his infantry training with the 76th Infantry Division. November 1944. The troop transport ship SS Europa pitched and rolled through gray Atlantic swells as it carried Bob and 3,000 other American soldiers toward Le Havre, France. Bob spent most of the 2-week crossing in his cramped bunk below deck, trying not to think about what awaited them in Europe. He was now Private Robert Mitchell, serial number 374566789, rifleman in L Company, 2nd Battalion, 301st Regiment of the 76th Infantry Division. His dreams of leading men as an officer had been replaced by the reality of carrying a 30-pound pack and an M1 Garand rifle. 3 months after the initial Normandy landings, Bob finally set foot on European soil at Omaha Beach. The famous landing site still bore the terrible scars of D-Day. Massive concrete pillboxes stood shattered and broken. Twisted metal obstacles jutted from the sand like skeletal fingers. Most haunting of all were the countless small wooden crosses that marked temporary graves in the dunes behind the beach. My God, Bob had thought as he walked past row after row of white crosses. How did anyone survive this? The scope of the sacrifice was overwhelming. He felt lucky to have missed the initial invasion, yet guilty for arriving only after others had paid such a terrible price. From Omaha Beach, the 76th Division traveled by truck convoy across the French countryside. Bob saw firsthand the devastation that months of fighting had left behind. Entire villages reduced to rubble, blackened tanks abandoned in fields, and always the smell of death that seemed to cling to everything. They passed through Normandy's hedgerow country, where vicious fighting had raged for weeks after D-Day. Local French civilians lined the roads, waving American flags and offering wine and flowers to the passing soldiers. Children ran alongside the trucks shouting, "Merci, merci," and holding up 2 fingers in victory signs. But Bob could see the toll the war had taken on these people. The men were mostly old or very young. The ones of fighting age had been killed, captured, or were hiding with the resistance. The women wore faces aged beyond their years, marked by months of terror, hunger, and uncertainty. The division continued through France into Belgium, then finally to the German border near the small town of Bergstein. Here, they would face their first real combat against the Germans' heavily fortified West Wall, known to the Allies as the Siegfried Line. L Company was assigned to assault positions overlooking the Kahl River Valley. Intelligence reports indicated they would face elements of the German 12th Infantry Division, veterans who had been fighting on the Eastern Front before being transferred west. These weren't green recruits, they were experienced, desperate men fighting for their homeland. The company commander, Captain Morrison, gathered his men for the final briefing on November 16th. L Company consisted of 198 men organized into 3 rifle platoons and a weapons platoon. Bob was assigned to 2nd Platoon as a rifleman, carrying his M1 Garand, 96 rounds of ammunition, 2 hand grenades, and a bayonet. "Men," Captain Morrison's voice was grim in the gathering darkness, "tomorrow we attack what intelligence calls Bunker 47. It's a reinforced concrete fortification containing an estimated 40 German soldiers with machine guns, mortars, and anti-tank weapons. Our job is to take it." Bob looked around at his fellow soldiers. Most were his age or younger, farm boys from Ohio, factory workers from Cleveland and Toledo, college students like himself whose educations had been interrupted by war. They were scared. He could see it in their eyes, the way they unconsciously checked and rechecked their equipment. "The attack begins at 6 a.m., Morrison continued. "1st Platoon takes the left flank, 2nd Platoon advances up the center, 3rd Platoon secures our right. Artillery will prep the target for 30 minutes before we move out." Bob thought this would be a normal operation, perhaps difficult, but achievable. He was horribly wrong. November 17th, 1944, 5:30 a.m. The American artillery barrage began exactly on schedule. For 30 minutes, 105mm and 155mm shells screamed overhead and exploded against the German positions. The noise was deafening, a continuous thunder that seemed to shake the very earth. Bob crouched in his foxhole with the other men of 2nd Platoon, watching the orange flashes illuminate the pre-dawn darkness. Surely nothing could survive such bombardment. When the shelling stopped at precisely 6 a.m., an eerie silence fell over the battlefield. "Let's go," Lieutenant Palmer shouted, blowing his whistle. L Company rose from their positions and began advancing across the muddy field toward their objective. The first 100 yards went smoothly. No enemy fire, no resistance. Bob began to feel optimistic. Then, the German machine guns opened up. The sound was unlike anything Bob had ever heard, a rapid-fire chattering that seemed to fill the air with deadly metal. The German MG-42 machine gun could fire over 1,200 rounds per minute, earning it the nickname Hitler's buzzsaw from Allied soldiers. Men began falling immediately. Sergeant Rodriguez, walking 10 feet to Bob's left, suddenly spun around and collapsed, blood spreading across his chest. Private Williams from Toledo simply disappeared in a spray of red mist when a burst caught him in the head. "Get down! Get down!" someone screamed. Bob threw himself behind a small rise in the ground, pressing his face into the cold mud as bullets whined overhead. All around him, men were crying out, some calling for medics, others simply screaming in pain and terror. The attack stalled within minutes. Of the 60 men in 2nd Platoon who had begun the advance, only about 30 were still able to fight. The others were dead, wounded, or too terrified to move. This was just the beginning. For the next 5 days and nights, L Company would attempt to take Bunker 47. Each attack followed the same terrible pattern: brief artillery preparation, desperate advance across open ground, devastating German fire, retreat to lick their wounds and count their losses. On the second day, they tried flanking the position from the left. 40 men crept through a small woods, hoping to surprise the German defenders. Instead, they walked into a carefully prepared kill zone. Hidden machine gun nests opened fire from 3 directions simultaneously. Only 12 men made it back. Bob watched in horror as his friend Danny O'Brien from Boston stumbled back through the trees, his left arm hanging uselessly at his side, blood streaming down his face from a head wound. "They were waiting for us," Danny gasped before collapsing. "They knew we were coming." The third day brought air support. A P-47 Thunderbolt fighter bomber screamed low over the battlefield and dropped a 500-pound bomb directly on Bunker 47. Bob watched in amazement as the massive concrete structure seemed to lift into the air, hover for a moment, then settle back into place. When the smoke cleared, the machine gun fire resumed immediately. The bunker's 3-foot-thick reinforced concrete walls had absorbed the blast with minimal damage. By the 4th day, L Company had been reduced to fewer than 80 effective soldiers. Captain Morrison had been wounded and evacuated. Lieutenant Palmer was dead, killed by a sniper while trying to coordinate an attack. Sergeant Thompson, a veteran of the fighting in Italy, was now in command. "We're going to try one more time," Thompson told the exhausted survivors that evening. "This time we go at night. Small teams, get in close with satchel charges and grenades." Bob volunteered for the mission along with 5 other men: Tommy Rodriguez from San Antonio, Jack Morrison from Cincinnati, Eddie Walsh from Cleveland, Mike Kowalski from Detroit, and Danny O'Brien from Boston. They were young men, scared but determined, united by the shared knowledge that they might not see another sunrise. The plan was simple in its desperation. Wait for complete darkness, then crawl across the 300 yards of open ground to reach Bunker 47. Plant explosive charges against the concrete walls, retreat quickly before detonation. It was essentially a suicide mission, and everyone knew it. At 11 p.m. on November 21st, 6 American soldiers began what they all believed would be their final mission. The night was overcast with no moon, which provided welcome concealment, but made navigation nearly impossible. Bob crawled on his belly through the cold mud, following Tommy Rodriguez, who had volunteered to lead the team. Behind him came the others, each man carrying 20 pounds of explosive charges in addition to their normal combat equipment. The German defenders weren't sleeping. Flares periodically lit up the battlefield with harsh white light, forcing the Americans to freeze in place and hope they hadn't been spotted. Machine gun bursts would sweep the area randomly, harassing fire designed to prevent exactly what they were attempting. It took 3 hours to cover 300 yards, 3 hours of crawling through mud, barbed wire, and the decomposing bodies of soldiers who had died in previous attacks. The smell was overwhelming: cordite, blood, human waste, and the sweet cloying odor of death. Bob found himself pressed against the cold earth next to Tommy Rodriguez and Jack Morrison. The three had become close friends during training in Louisiana. Tommy was the comedian of the group, always ready with a joke or funny story to lighten the mood. Jack was the intellectual, a former college student like Bob who could discuss literature and philosophy for hours. Now they huddled together in no man's land, listening to the sounds of death around them and wondering if they would live to see morning. "You know what I keep thinking about?" Jack whispered during a brief lull in the firing. "What?" Bob replied, his voice barely audible. "My girlfriend back home, Susan. I was going to ask her to marry me when I get back." Jack's voice was wistful in the darkness. "Had it all planned out? Dinner at the fancy restaurant downtown, ring in my pocket, the whole thing?" "You still will," Tommy said firmly. "We're getting out of this." But even as he spoke, they could hear German voices in the distance, growing closer. The enemy was patrolling. 50 yards from their objective, disaster struck. A German flare burst directly overhead, illuminating the 6 Americans in its stark white light. For a frozen moment, nobody moved. Then, the machine guns opened fire. Tracers, bullets with phosphorus tips that glowed bright red in flight, filled the air like deadly fireworks. The sound was indescribable, a constant hammering punctuated by the crack of bullets passing inches from their heads. "The house!" Tommy shouted, pointing to a small German farmhouse 20 yards to their right. "Get to the house!" They ran through the hellish fire, diving and rolling as bullets kicked up dirt around their feet. Somehow, all 6 made it to the building and crashed through the front door. The house was empty but offered crucial protection from the German machine guns. They took positions along the interior walls, breathing heavily and trying to process what had just happened. "Jesus Christ," Eddie Walsh gasped. "How are we still alive?" "Don't celebrate yet," Tommy replied grimly. "We're still trapped here." Outside, the German fire continued sporadically. They were clearly visible to enemy observers, pinned down with no way to advance or retreat. Worse, the Germans were beginning to drop mortar rounds around the house, each explosion shaking the building and raining plaster from the ceiling. Bob found himself pressed against the eastern wall next to Tommy Rodriguez and Jack Morrison. They could hear German voices outside, growing closer with each passing minute. Then came the sound that would change everything: the unmistakable rumble of an approaching tank. Through a crack in the wall, Bob could see a British Sherman tank advancing toward their position. The tank commander had emerged from the turret hatch and was scanning the area with binoculars, clearly trying to assess the situation. The tank was part of the British armored unit that had been assigned to support the American infantry attack. Bob could see the commander directing his gunner, pointing toward Bunker 47 and coordinating fire support. "Thank God," Eddie whispered. "The cavalry's here." Tank Commander William "Bill" Thompson had indeed spotted the trapped Americans. More importantly, he understood their desperate situation and was determined to help them survive. The Sherman's 75mm gun began hammering Bunker 47 with high-explosive shells. Each shot lit up the battlefield with orange fire and sent shockwaves through the ground. Thompson exposed himself in the tank turret, standing upright to get better visibility and direct his gunner's fire more effectively. It was incredibly brave and incredibly dangerous. Bob watched in admiration as the British tank commander systematically targeted the German machine gun positions that had them pinned down. Thompson was saving their lives, and he was doing it at enormous personal risk. The bombardment was methodical, professional. Thompson would point to a target, his gunner would traverse the turret, and another high-explosive shell would slam into the German positions. Slowly, the machine gun fire that had kept them trapped began to slacken. "He's giving us a chance," Tommy said, his voice filled with hope for the first time in hours. But then came the shot that changed everything. a German sniper, hidden somewhere in the ruins of Bunker 47, fired a single perfectly aimed bullet. Bob saw Thompson jerk suddenly, then slump forward over the edge of the turret hatch. The British tank commander was dead, killed while trying to save 6 American soldiers whose names he didn't even know. "No," Bob cried out, though his voice was lost in the noise of battle. That man had died for them. He had exposed himself to enemy fire, made himself a target, all to give 6 strangers a chance to live. His sacrifice would stay with Bob for the rest of his life. The tank continued firing for several more minutes before withdrawing, its crew unaware that their commander had been killed. Under cover of the continued bombardment, the 6 Americans were finally able to retreat to their own lines. But the image of Thompson's death would never leave Bob's mind. Every night for the next 78 years, he would see the British tank commander slumping forward in the turret, dying while trying to save them. L Company was withdrawn after 5 days. Of 198 men who began the attack, only 43 remained able to fight. They had failed to take Bunker 47. 3 weeks later, during the Battle of the Bulge, American artillery accidentally hit Bob's position. Shrapnel tore through his leg and back. 2 medics ran to save him. Both were killed by a second shell as they reached his position. Bob spent 4 months in military hospitals, then returned home in 1945. He finished his engineering degree, married Helen, had 2 children, and worked for the State Highway Department. But he never talked about the war. For 76 years, he carried those memories alone. Every night, he saw Thompson dying in the tank turret, watched his friends disappear in explosions, felt the weight of survivors' guilt. In 2019, Bob's daughter Margaret set up a Facebook account for him. Bob showed little interest until March 2020, when he received a message from military historian Michael Porter. Porter was researching the Battle of Bunker 47 and had found the battlefield site. He had located artifacts and was looking for survivors. "I also have information that would be of great personal interest to you," Porter wrote. After 76 years of silence, Bob agreed to a phone call. Porter had incredible news. He had found the son of Lieutenant William Thompson, the British tank commander who died saving Bob's unit. David Thompson was 82 years old, living near Manchester, England. He had been 5 when his father left for war, old enough to remember a tall man in uniform, but too young for meaningful conversations. For 77 years, David had known only basic facts. His father was killed in Germany in November 1944. No details, no witnesses, no story to explain why his father never came home. The first phone call between Bob and David was emotional. "Your father saved our lives," Bob said, his voice trembling. "We were trapped, surrounded by German machine guns. He brought his tank forward and gave us covering fire. He didn't have to do that." David was crying. What was he like in those final moments? He was in command, professional. He stood up in the turret where he could see better, even though it made him a target. He cared more about getting us out alive than his own safety. Did he suffer? It was instant, a sniper's bullet. He wouldn't have felt any pain. They talked for 2 hours that first night, Bob sharing details he had never told anyone, David learning about his father's final hours from the only person alive who witnessed them. Over the following weeks, they spoke regularly. Bob told David about the courage of both American and British soldiers, about the terrible cost of war. David shared his story of growing up without a father, his lifelong questions about the man he barely remembered. "I've visited his grave many times," David said during one conversation, "but I never knew what to say to him." "Tell him his death meant everything," Bob replied firmly. 6 American soldiers went home to their families because of what your father did that night. After his conversations with David Thompson, Bob Mitchell began to open up about his past for the first time in 76 years. He showed Margaret the contents of the wooden chest, his Bronze Star Medal, Purple Heart, Combat Infantry Badge, a notebook containing names of every man in L Company who died, letters he had written to their families but never sent. News spread through the retirement community. Their quiet neighbor was a decorated war veteran. Children who called him Grandpa Bob learned he was a real hero. Bob began giving talks at local schools, sharing his story for the first time. I was silent for 76 years because some memories are too painful, he would tell students. But finding David changed everything. Now I know that sacrifice wasn't wasted. David Thompson visits his father's grave regularly now, armed with Bob's story. Now I know who my father was, he says, a real hero who died saving others. Bob and David continue to talk regularly, two old men connected by bonds forged in war 78 years ago. Thompson's sacrifice saved 6 lives, Bob says. Thanks to David, I'm at peace now too. Have you ever discovered your neighbor's hidden past? Do ordinary-seeming people have extraordinary stories? Share them in the comments. At Hidden Legends, we continue discovering these hidden heroes living among us. If this story moved you, like and subscribe. Help these real heroes' stories continue to be told. Until the next video, remember, the quiet neighbor sitting next to you might just be a witness to history.